Hi everybody, welcome to the latest episode of FinOps on Azure. This podcast where we aim to get together with people from the Microsoft community to talk about how we apply FinOps, cost management and cost optimization principles with a perspective of Microsoft Azure technologies. Today I'm joined by a very good friend of mine, Richard Fennell, who I've known for many years when we were younger men. Richard's a fellow Microsoft MVP, and today's topic, we're going to start talking about the relationship between FinOps, cost management, and DevOps. Richard's he's, in my opinion, one of the best DevOps people out there. Richard's the person that I ask when I have a DevOps question that I get stuck with. Richard, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Yeah, thanks. As Mike just said, my name's Richard Fennell. I'm the CTO here at Black Marble. We're a Microsoft Gold partner and GitHub partner who's based up in Yorkshire, and we've been going over 25 years now. The part of the business I focus on mostly is DevOps. So I've been working historically with TFS since it came out in 2005 and all the various iterations in between, and increasingly doing more and more work with GitHub. So I spend most of my time either consulting with our clients or working on our own internal teams to help improve our DevOps processes, whether that's be tracking work, automated builds, automating testing, and obviously automating deployment into services like Azure using infrastructure as code technologies.
What's your balance these days, Richard, with DevOps and GitHub in terms of Azure DevOps and GitHub?
I think for us, as a company, it's still predominantly Azure DevOps, but I think part of that is down to our company reputation that we are known as a DevOps company. We're seeing an increasing amount of GitHub Enterprise appearing now, and a lot of my personal and community work now is mostly on GitHubs, purely because you need to learn it, and you always learn things best by actually doing it, a real project on a real platform. Yeah. So I'm trying to do far more with GitHub Actions. If I have the choice, I'll use GitHub Actions.
So you're quite often involved in some of the preview activities that Microsoft and GitHub do, aren't you?
Yeah.
And those kind of things. Yeah. So perfect person really to have us talking about this topic with us. So Richard, what I'm really interested in your perspective of is Dev FinOps is one of the happening sort of buzzwords in the FinOps world at the minute, and I'm interested to get your perspective on the relationship between FinOps and DevOps as concepts and where you see the practices within them touch on each other.
I think definitely they are both big buzzwords, and the two tied together at the moment is a common conversation. I think FinOps has been the newer kid on the block, so to speak. It's coming in and sort of filling a gap. Historically, we were looking at DevOps being almost, in our industry is full of silver bullets that are going to fix absolutely everything in organizations. If we just had an automated deployment, we'd have no problems. If we could just run all our automated tests. And yes, DevOps has fixed an awful lot of problems. It's brought our IT departments closer together to the dev test, having a broad engineering approach. And we can now, with things like Bicep and automated builds, get our systems deployed far more reliably up into services like Azure. And it allows us to experiment more, which is I've always seen as one of the big benefits that isn't talked about enough in DevOps, is that once you've managed to get all of your deployment automated, deploying your binaries, but also deploying your infrastructure using infrastructure as code, you can try different things. You can go, I'll spin up a bigger one or a smaller one and see what happens. And what we very often forget is to switch them off or turn them back down. And I'm sure pretty much everybody has had a somewhat frightening bill at some point, or burnt through all of their monthly free credit or whatever, because they forgot to get rid of a Cosmo DB that was needed for a database, or they ran a stupidly big SQL box to see how fast it could go for some project and forgot to turn it back down again. And that's where I think FinOps really starts to come in. It's the commonest conversation route I have in for it is sort of, well, you're doing all this stuff, you're running it, but do you actually know how big it is at the moment, or what it is going to cost you, or what it might cost you, or what can you do to optimize that cost? So that's where I see the synergy coming in. It's FinOps sort of fills a bit of a gap in that keeps you honest,
Yeah.
or reminds you of what you've done wrong.
So I think that I was going to mention that we talked earlier, and you mentioned that phrase of "it keeps you honest," which I think is quite a good little sort of tagline, I guess, for the relationship there, isn't it? So in terms of your day-to-day job, beyond being CTO, you're obviously doing DevOps activities and leading DevOps teams on a regular basis. What kind of things from the FinOps world are most commonly coming up in your day job? I mean, obviously there's a conversation aspect, but what about from an implementation aspect as well?
I think the implementation one is that when people you've had the conversation and the client or someone exterior to the tech team has realised that you've got something potentially costly here running in the cloud, that it was sold as, oh, the cloud will save you money, and it does if you provision it right and think about what you're doing. But it's, as I said, it's easy to let it run away with you. And it's that entry point to the conversation then brings you into, well, how would I check to see how much this is going to cost? Can you make an estimate what this will cost over a year? Will it get more expensive if we have more customers? All of those sorts of conversations. And I'm not necessarily certain in many of my engagements where the word FinOps is being used specifically, but the conversation is happening without that label. And with the advent of articles and podcasts like this and all of those sorts of things, with the term FinOps being in there, because it has become a lot of a buzzword very recently, it's focusing on conversations that were already happening and maybe giving them higher priority, or they're happening sooner as opposed to they're not waiting for the frightening bill. They're happening before the frightening bill arrives.
And do you think that that changes the people that are involved in the conversation as well? I guess maybe there's a more senior management interest in it than there used to be.
Definitely, yeah. But I think that calls back to DevOps, that often DevOps has slipped into an organisation because the engineering team, in its widest sense, where IT pros, testers, devs, whatever, has tried to drive it forward to see a route to gain quality. But as we always say, unless you've got sort of senior C-level managers giving some air cover and helping it drive forward, you're just going to hit barriers. You know, if you go back and read the Phoenix Project book, you'll always see that it requires champions to help push through the barriers. And I think you're quite right here that as soon as we start to talk FinOps, we need a champion coming through with a credit who's looking at the billing and is concerned about not spending the money. Yes, it does definitely bring different people to the table, but arguably there were people who should have been at the table in the first place. But as with DevOps identified who wasn't at the table because they were not the barrier to success, but that they were needed as the catalyst to allow the project to actually succeed.
So do you view, I love that idea of champions. I think that's really important to customers being successful for cost management. Do you find there's a big opportunity for people in the DevOps world to be cost management champions, to kind of from a personal perspective raise their profile and kind of get more opportunities because they're seen as caring about the costs and being able to kind of control them and, you know, be seen to be doing efficient things? Or do you think it's something people haven't cottoned on to an opportunity yet?
I think it's probably the latter. Is it hasn't been seen as much, but it's certainly something that certainly will do your profile no harm. It's always good when a customer or inside a larger organisation, the senior management identify a team or a person as this is somebody who delivers stuff on time and to budget. If you want to add on the end, and it doesn't bankrupt the company while we run it. You could argue that the whole FinOps story is really just another sort of non-functional requirement. You know, the non-functional requirement is it should cost an appropriate amount, whatever you're choosing to measure that with. You know, whether you're measuring the running cost is something related to the sales revenue it generates or just a fixed cost. But at least, you know, if you can run it for half the price, you've improved the value of the return on investment on your project.
That's a really good point you touched on there. Cost as a non-functional requirement. It's something we've got lined up to do some content around, actually, because I think it's really obvious when you think about it, isn't it? It's like we have performance and latency requirements and users we can support, but actually the running cost of it, maybe beforehand, before cloud, because it was a very fixed cost, people didn't worry too much about it because it was a known. But now you kind of have to test your cost, don't you?
Historically, your cloud cost was sort of counting the VMs and multiplying by a number. But now we've got so many software as a service or platform as a service like solutions where you've got to make, take something like Azure Functions. So you've got to make a choice as to what sort of billing models you want to use for things. And it's not necessarily obvious which is the right one, because it might be that if you use one billing model that switches on some features which are fine, but you switch on different features, it costs a little more but makes the general running cheaper, and there's hard balancing acts. And you can also roll it back before you've even deployed the product. There's a lot of push at the moment, particularly in the GitHub space, around I was about to say Copilot. It's the wrong one. It's code spaces, around code spaces where you've got a virtual development environment, or using Azure DevOps if you want to use Visual Studio in the cloud. That's another cost that you can minimize. You can choose how big those VMs are. There's an awful lot of optimization with both of those products to make sure that, say, they're only running during office hours. That's built-in features. But if nobody switches it on, you're burning 3 times the amount you would if you just did it during office hours. And also, are those right sized? You can choose how big those VMs are. And the danger is, everybody goes, well, I just need the biggest one I can have, please. When you could get away with something far smaller if you're just editing, web content or something like that. You don't need the oomph of the back-end processor all the time. So it's right-sizing things for given projects all the way down the DevOps delivery line.
So when it comes to decision making, then Richard, for some of these design decisions around cost and SKUs, how do you find the roles on projects that you work on come into play? So I'm imagining, obviously, you've got architects who'll propose a design, come up with a bunch of artifacts, and then developers who build against that, and then in DevOps you're provisioning some of that infrastructure. But do you find that there's like really a playback to say, look, once we've got this design into the DevOps world, we want to change bits of it, and the bit about changing the SKUs and the price plans, do you think that becomes an iterative process, and who's involved where?
Yeah, it's one thing we've certainly seen in DevOps adoption projects. It's been a not uncommon piece of feedback when we've gone in and done sort of hackathon efforts to sort of let's move something that used to take days to do to get it to work in hours through modern DevOps processes. That one of the benefits people often come out and say is it allows us to be so much more experimental. Historically, if we wanted to see if running more cores would fix it, we'd have to find the budget, order the server, wait for it to arrive, wait for somebody to move it from the loading dock into a rack, and by which time someone else will have probably nicked the machine for some other project. It's the normal corporate way of working on these. Whereas now, it's literally you tweak a value in a file and redeploy, hopefully to another instance, so you could do side-by-side comparisons if that's what you want.
Yeah, so it's
but I don't think that's, so coming back to your question, I don't think that's being identified as the FinOps guy role, so to speak. But it's hopefully something that all of the engineers are considering while they're working here. Well, it works fine like this. Should I turn it down, run it on a smaller one? Will it still work good enough? It's a conversation that arrives late, but at least we do have the tooling now that we can.
So I guess when I'm asking the question, I suppose I'm thinking of before the project goes live, you've got the architect and the DevOps team, but then I guess after go live, you're more likely to have a FinOps governance person asking questions about ongoing costs, and that may influence changes that DevOps do. And then I guess there's a question about, well, can we bring that FinOps person earlier in the life cycle to give that cost perspective during development and testing, even probably has benefits?
Yeah, I think that's very true. And it's in the same way that in a mature project, you're probably going to do some performance testing. Maybe there is an argument fact, that performance testing is considered in the light of FinOps testing. Balancing the cost against the performance is what I come back to is a requirement. There's an optimum point where it's fast enough and cheap enough. Just a case of working out exactly where that is.
Okay, so if we take a slightly different steer for the next question. So when you're thinking about the design of a solution, obviously you've got things like estimation of costs. How do you compare the estimation of costs with what it costs in the real world and keep track of those differences, and kind of how do you change stuff when you think it's not right?
I'm not certain there's too much formality yet in that part of the development cycle. I think it is a case of, as with any dev team, the first requirement is, can you get the thing stood up and working? And then we'll worry about sorting out the costing at a later date. It's that. So I think the answer is there will be some estimates originally that's probably come from nothing greatly more sophisticated than the Azure pricing calculator, maybe a spreadsheet related to it. But then I think it's once you start to get something stood up in some sort of dev test queue or something like that, that's when you can start to actually look at the metrics, look at the real running costs, and start to make some sensible iterations, hopefully while you're still before you've gone live. But it's not a fundamental problem due to the great features of all of the cloud services that we can rescale things while the services are running. And it comes back to that whole point around good experimentation. But you need someone's got to go and look. It's one of these, none of these things are magic, and that's the area that I think isn't happening often enough for an awful lot of teams.
So with cost optimization, then Richard, tell me about some of the cool cost optimizations that you remember doing over the years.
The commonest ones are, I think they fall into two broad categories. There's the cost optimizations that come in that because somebody has completely forgotten to do something, as I say, forgotten to scale something down, and you can actually save a massive amount of cost at that point. But then I think arguably they're the sort of slap yourself on the head, why didn't I remember to do that sort of thing? But I don't think they're the interesting ones. I think the more interesting ones are where you've got a system that's running and you can optimize the cost by, as I say, tweaking a SKU that's being used. And often by changing a SKU to something that's not necessarily as obvious, maybe turning one thing up to save cost on the overall, they tend to be the ones that are more interesting to work on and to discover. But as I say, it's often a luxury to have a luxury to spend time on a project to actually look for the cost saving. From my position as DevOps, my role's often ended before we get to that point.
I guess there's also an element for a customer about things change, don't they, over time? So one of the ones I wonder about is, as a customer, how do I keep up with the fact that Microsoft brings new plans out? Does that affect how I'm going to deploy stuff? Does it give me opportunities to save money? And then the more I've invested in a DevOps process, the more I can take advantage of that. I guess two examples that spring to mind are things like the new APIM plans and the new, I can't remember if it's GA yet, I think it's probably preview still, but the flex consumption plan for functions where you get network support, but you're still on a consumption model. I think, to me, one of the benefits of the investment in DevOps is being able to change your solution to adopt those new things without it being a complete rebuild.
As I say, you've got a means, hopefully, with a good DevOps process to provision out a test instance to see if it still fundamentally works on the new SKU and you haven't missed something obvious. But equally, it should be relatively straightforward to push out the change. Every feature change is slightly different, and obviously it requires due diligence. But we've certainly got that option there to make those experimental changes quickly and easily. But I think the key point there is the discovery. We see an awful lot of customer sites where a solution got built, and then time has passed, whether it be 6 months or 6 years, and you come back to it and it's now running out of date, SDKs and everything. When it's on-prem, it's not perfect, but you're behind firewalls and hopefully OSs are patched and all those things are not too bad. But with the cloud, things just go away, and you've got to keep an eye on these. Well, you're meant to keep an eye on these services as they change, but too often people aren't. They're not keeping an eye on things. And, it's like your mobile phone contract, isn't it? You let it expire. It falls back onto some eye-wateringly expensive tariff when there's a far cheaper one you could have moved to.
I think,
and arguably that's the most immediate. The FinOps discussion forces people to keep an eye on what their options are, and it might be that they just need to keep it ticking over on the same SKU. But as you say, for a lot of things, there's new SKUs coming along that make a lot of sense. But equally, there's new technologies. And if you might have something now running in a VM, but there'll be a new version of Super Service X that allows you to stop having to run that in a VM and move it over. But that's a bigger engineering job. But again, we can experiment inside our infrastructure and fire the stuff over and try another one. But the FinOps side is someone's got to be proactive about it, because if you don't, the things will just keep running and keep racking up costs.
I think that's a really great point as well, because I think the most common scenario we see where people are wasting money is we provision something in, a year ago. The users love it because it works great, and nobody ever looks at it again because the users aren't complaining. And then you realise that actually the users love it because it's twice as big as it needs to be, so it works great for them. But you've wasted tens of thousands paying for a machine that's much bigger than it needs to be. And I think that's the gap, isn't it? It's kind of, and I guess in the DevOps role, I guess one of the questions is, where's the overlap in? Are you the recipient of the insight to then empower you to do something, or are you the people who look for the insights, or is there a bit of both, I guess?
Well, I think this is where it differs, whether I'm wearing my consultant hat or whether I'm wearing my Black Marble CTO hat. Because I think as a consultant, you're rarely involved in the ongoing. What's the health? If you're called in, it's because somebody's had that horrible bill and they want to do something about it, or they want to fix the process. So that's a different beast. But for the ongoing stuff, if you look at the sort of DevOps processes that, as they're sort of always discussed, where you've got a team who owns a product from inception through delivery, and they own it in production as well. At that point, it becomes part of the team's responsibility to not just sit there and wait till it falls over, to actually proactively keep an eye on it. And that means patching for vulnerabilities, making sure it's on the latest frameworks, or the most appropriate latest frameworks. And equally, is it on the right SKUs? Is it on the right services? So it's that complete life cycle. So FinOps just becomes a formalization of the keeping an eye on it while it's running, in the same way you'd set up App Insights and keep an eye on its exceptions that are being thrown and all of those things. Or if it's a VM, has its hard drive filled up, all that sort of stuff. We can look at its costs. Are its costs spiking suddenly? Are they not? And historically, that's meant pouring through logs, whether it be App Insights or looking at the costing stuff in Azure. But as I say, because of FinOps movement and all of that, the tools that do a better job and do some of that reporting in the same way App Insights means you don't have to look at every log file yourself. It starts to ease the process and make it slicker. You can get the dynamic alerts.
So I think there's a couple of things you said there really make me think about some of the discussions I've had with the team at Black Marble recently. So I think the idea was with Black Marble, I think, was that you guys were going to start offering out a FinOps service to help customers where they struggle to do that, keep an eye on things themselves a little bit. So you could kind of go to them and go, by the way, do you know you're spending this? Here's some opportunities to save. What's your thoughts on that as a service offering for customers who struggle with that piece?
Well, I think it sits nicely on a service offering we already have to sort of keep people's. People always say every company now is a software company with a hobby, and that's not necessarily true. That it is, in the sense that most businesses are driven by some sort of software. but an awful lot of those companies don't have the skills in-house to maintain the software, and that's historically been Black Marble's market space. We predominantly write integration related, bolting things together to serve up some sort of software for people. And for quite a few customers, we end up managing that for them. And historically, the management has been keeping it running, keeping an eye on the logs, and as part of the annual process, we'll probably patch the thing up to date every so often. We're moving far more into a cost optimization area for that. And so it becomes that can either be a service that stands alone for somebody who's identified a problem, or it can be the ongoing service. Both of them become nice managed services that we can offer.
I think one of the importances of a managed service, that we've just recently written a white paper about how I do this internally with one of our product teams, is that idea of sometimes the team can be too close to the solution to kind of have an objective view on the costs, and they can be too focused on we've got to deliver new features and new requirements, and they take priority. And I think having that external person, coming back to the keep you honest idea, is they're looking at what you're doing and asking questions and saying, this cost here, can you explain what that's about? And I think that's really where that kind of offering comes in for teams like yourself, isn't it? Where you're technical enough to ask the right questions, distant enough to not be biased on the perspective on it, and then sometimes you'll get some fantastic insights out of it, and cost savings come from it.
Oh yeah, it's we find that across the board with the consultancy, whether we're consulting on cloud adoption or in DevOps or all of those. Often in organisations, there's a way the organisation does something, for good or for bad, and there can often be a huge resistance to change, and just the external voice. Well, the classic one is the external voice either comes in and says something new and radical, which can be useful, or they echo what teams have been saying internally that hasn't been heard by senior management. Even though it's been said, I'm sure we've both been in that place where all we're doing is echoing what some poor soul has been saying for the past 4 years at a customer. They listen to us, but they never listen to them. But yes, it's too easy it's up and running, it's doing great, we're all happy with it, but is it running in the most efficient manner? Whether efficiency be measured by cost or throughput or whatever, it's definitely it's another string to the bow. There's a consultant in the adoption area that sort of helps us try and get people moving to more modern, efficient solutions.
What kind of things, Richard, at the minute are exciting you technology-wise that you think have an interest and cost angle to them?
I think the main one is moving more and more things into logic apps and function apps that have previously been sitting as services that were running maybe on as app services or in VMs or Docker containers or things like that. It's the paring back and trying to get back to the core essence of the business requirement, and get those out and running on the, I was going to say the thinnest service, but that's probably the wrong term, the most appropriate service to run them on without the extra heavy weight.
I think it's that idea. I was going to say, I think it's that idea of how do I solve the business problem and not create 50 new technical problems to doesn't it?
And it's the whole argument of cloud is that sort of that you move things up the stack. We don't want to be managing the Ethernet switch if we don't have to. We don't want to be managing the VMs if we don't have to. We move up. But the corollary of that is that we're now running on a platform that we don't quite control, so we're forced to keep up. But that's arguably not a bad thing, because otherwise, I was recently upgrading a TFS server that hadn't been patched since 2010. So, these systems exist out there, and they're best dealt with sooner rather than later. I suppose, though, when we're recording, it's during Microsoft's Build 2024 conference, and they're obviously the big buzz on everything is AI, everything's AI. So I think that's the other area of interest, of sort of, we're all talking around with the FinOps, we're looking at these things and making judgments based on the tooling and the reporting to try things out? Will that be better, or do we still get the performance for reduced cost? It'll be interesting to see how that moves forwards with adding AI tooling into there to make the suggestions. And I think the interesting one across the board is how far we go with closing the loop. That how far is the human still involved in making those optimization choices? Because we're sort of seeing the same with tools like GitHub Enterprise Advanced Security, in that it's now, we've already had Dependerbots suggesting fixes to update vulnerabilities, and now you can get it to make suggestions based on core coding practices. So it's interesting, when will it start making a suggestion? Or I think you should run this on a different SKU of this product.
It's an interesting thing we were looking at recently about the idea of, do you let your tool and resize the plans without you even having to approve it within, maybe within certain kind of criteria. But I think with the interesting one for me with that is, for a lot of companies, they want an approval process and a governance process, and like that sits alongside it. And the questions, well, technically we could build a solution easily that says, let's just change your VM from large to small. But actually, the processes and people in an IT organization aren't lined up to support that. I think for 95% of companies probably aren't they. If you think of the typical enterprise, there's normally change control board, change documentation, have we tested it, test evidence, and the actual action of changing it is often a few seconds. But I don't know how does AI deal with the process of an organization? Maybe, is there a request that completely needs to change, or maybe it does for some organizations and not others? But it's going to be exciting, that space, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it is, but I think that whole point around change boards and all of those sorts of areas is an area that DevOps has talked around a lot, often sort of pushing them aside and going, well, no, we don't need this because we have this robust process where we have an automated build, we're source controlling all of these changes. So it becomes an interesting question that if you've got a solution making a cost decision to change from a small to a large VM, well, maybe the answer is it writes a pull request, pushes it into the code base, and then it follows the same automated build, or maybe manually approved releases. We can put manual gates into all of this stuff. So you've still got that process. So it in the same way that GitHub Copilot talks around being your co-pilot, your navigator, your driver, it will make suggestions, but you have to action them by a pull request. Maybe that's the mechanism we're going to have for quite a foreseeable future. It gets a little more interesting if you're talking about changing things in Azure without going back through the whole of the release pipeline. And that becomes an interesting not tension even, but an interesting difference between the sort of the FinOps optimizing it in production and pulling it through the whole of the pipeline. But it's an interesting discussion to have. I think we're early in that journey.
I think that loops right back around with the first question, doesn't it? The relationship between DevOps and FinOps. And I had the same question with Nino about security and FinOps in a previous episode. And my question's really, it's about, well, in a lot of ways, these two areas kind of trying to achieve similar things, have similar objectives, can really help each other out in an organization that does both of them well. And I think that's really the feature, isn't it? Regardless of what tooling and AI does, the two practices being compatible will help you be successful.
Yeah, no, I think we saw the same. There was a lot of push towards the sort of the SRE stuff that came out of Google for running things at scale. And I think there's crossover between DevOps and SRE and all of these various different areas, and FinOps just is another set of tools in that space. They're all trying to achieve the same: reliable systems running in a cost-effective manner that meet a business requirement, and we use whichever ones are the most appropriate or applicable in our organizations to try and get us to the best place we can as quickly as possible.
Awesome. Richard, at that point, do you have any other bits you'd like to add for today's podcast? I'll make that the last question because I think I've eaten up most of your time there.
No, I think I'm happy with that. It's good.
Thank you very much for joining us today. I really enjoyed some of the places we went with that chat. There were some good ideas. You've given me some ideas for things I might ask you about in the future as well, which is always good. That's why I love chatting to people at Black Marble, as I go in with a few questions and I come out with 20 more questions, but answers to all the ones I originally had, which is always
that's the nature of this. You have a chat with somebody, it spins off all sorts of ideas. We're all very quick to rush off and try them out to see what happens.
That's my favorite thing about the podcast is everyone I speak to, I'm trying to get like different people from different areas to add another angle to what we're doing. And and again, like Savvy today, to explore the relationship with DevOps and FinOps. There's things I just haven't thought about that I really think are really good, and it's good to hear, from your perspective, reinforcing some of the thinking I had about how we would do certain things, which is good as well. Thank you very much to the audience for listening today. We hope you enjoyed this episode of FinOps on Azure. We'd love to hear questions for future episodes, and maybe Richard would come back at some point. And we'd love to hear feedback on what things people would like to see on future episodes. So we've got some really good episodes coming up with different product teams and community members about different topics on Azure, where we'll deep dive into how to optimize certain types of resources, how to implement FinOps practices with Azure. So thank you for listening. Hope everyone has a great week.